a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, Memoir Nation listeners. This is Brooke, and I am here to tell you about the class called Back to the Basics, Essential Craft for Memoirists, which starts on Monday, September 8th, which is today, if you happen to be listening on a Monday. But if you're listening later in the week, it's also not too late to join if you want to go check it out. The coolest thing about this class are the guest teachers: Piper Kerman, author of Orange is the New Black; Ashley C. Ford, author of Somebody's Daughter; Janine Ouellette, author of The Parts That Burn; and E.J. Coe, author of The Magical Language of Others. It's being co-hosted by me and Linda Joy Myers. We've been doing these memoir classes together for years, and we're super excited about this one because we are going back to that essential craft that everybody needs, no matter what, wherever you are in your process. So if you're looking for a cool memoir course this fall, this is it. And it starts today. Or if you're listening later in the week, it started yesterday or the day before yesterday. But still, come check us out, magicofmemoir.com.
Hello, mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, mothers and sons, and fathers and daughters, and all kinds of children and parents, past, present, and future. I'm Grant Faulkner, and I'm here with my co-host, Brooke Warner. And out of all of these family groupings that I just mentioned, I'm most intrigued by the mother-daughter relationship in particular, and that's because I just read Jeannie Vanasco's very fraught memoir about her relationship with her mother. I should say very loving memoir as well, and the memoir is called The Silent Treatment, and it places her mother's tendency to communicate through silent treatments at the center of the drama. And the subject has been on my mind because I witness mother-daughter relationships every day, both through my daughter and my wife and my sister and my mom. And then I hear about so many different kinds of mother-daughter relationships from others. And it's interesting to me because I often have mothers and daughters tell me how dramatic their relationships are, and in ways that are very different and very much more extreme than I think mothers and sons or fathers and sons. And so that's why I'm a bit obsessed by this subject. And we've actually touched on the mother-daughter relationship in numerous ways over the years. So I wanted to list some of the episodes that come to mind. Several years ago, we featured author Laura Davis on the episode The Staying Power of the Mother-Daughter Story. We recently had on Molly Jong Fast, who the theme of the show was opening a vein on the page as she did in discussing her relationship with her mom, the famous Erica Jong. We had Susan Liu on, who wrote The Manicurist's Daughter, which was about the fragility of the American dream and this really tight, unbreakable mother-daughter bond. And then Somebody's Daughter by Ashley C. Ford. And then, Brooke, you and your mom were featured in an episode titled Parent-Adult-Child Dynamic Writers. So since that episode featured you and your mom in conversation, I wanted to get your take on this relationship dynamic in general. And I asked that question within also the history of memoir because I think the mother-daughter relationship is a very strong subgenre of memoir in ways that other family relationships aren't.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting question and just a line of inquiry, actually, for anyone, for all of us thinking about our relationship dynamics with our parents. And I have a really strong relationship with my mom. And I also think anyone who has a great relationship with a parent is going to struggle in totally different ways from people who don't have good relationships with their parents. You know, things are tangled no matter what when it comes to memoir writing. And that spectrum I've just seen is quite broad and encompasses a lot of different kinds of reactions. When it comes to parent-child relationships, you know, there's expectations, there's the prospect of letting each other down, there can be projection, there can be codependence. You know, these aren't awful things. They're just common things that show up when you're working in that kind of context and when you're thinking about revealing yourself, or especially if you're thinking about revealing something about your parent. In worse kinds of relationships, of course, you have the stuff of punishment. You know, Jeannie, like you said, writes lovingly about her mother, but there's, you know, the silent treatment, which is certainly punitive. There are worse things. You know, there are moms who are complicit in their kids' abuse. There are moms who are abusive in their own right, of course. There are fathers as well, but we're talking about mother and daughter memoirs. working in memoir has really just made me grateful. I think that's one thing too, because I, over the years, have thought a lot about parent dynamics, maybe more than I would have otherwise, of course, if I weren't an editor and publisher of memoir. I've read awful stories, sad stories. The sad stories are things of neglect, abandonment, addiction. There are choices that parents make that put their kids in harm's way. And all of this, of course, is the raw material of memoir. And I actually am not sure I can even think of a memoir in which a parent is not considered or mentioned, even if they're not at the heart of the story. So it is pretty integral, this relationship, of course, and it forms who we are and who we've become. And so, yeah, I'm interested, Grant, to hear that you're more curious about the dynamics between mothers and daughters than fathers and sons per se. Maybe you could say more about that.
Yeah, it's hard for me to put my finger on it, but there seems to be something just very different about a mother-daughter relationship in general than, say, a mother-son or father-son relationship. And I say that because my mom has clearly expected things from my sister that she hasn't expected from me. So there are definitely some gender roles and expectations at work. And I have to confess that I've gotten off easy with my male privilege. I'm definitely treated differently. And I did a little bit of internet reading on the subject, and I read about how the daughter's story often involves defining herself in relation to or in opposition to her mother's choices and values. And so a daughter's need for independence can feel like rejection to the mother. And I think that's the case sometimes with my sister and mom, while the mother's involvement, can feel kind of suffocating to the daughter. And also, that embrace of independence, I just feel like it's so layered with complications. And I think that's so dramatic because of the limitations that might have been more rigidly embedded in mother's life. And for example, my mom, as open-minded and as liberal as she is, she came of age in the 50s, which was just a very different era for a woman than coming of age in the 60s or 70s or now. And we're all somehow products of our time. And I think my mom just deeply internalized the 50s definition of a woman in many ways. So that's a part of that relationship. And because of this, I read how many mothers, they may project their unfulfilled dreams or fears or self-hatred onto daughters. So mothers also might live vicariously through their daughters, but resent their daughters' opportunities at the same time. So they might perpetuate these kind of harmful cultural messages about women's worth and appearance and roles, even as they're celebrating their daughters for breaking free. And so I think that history, just isn't as thick or as present with fathers and sons. For example, I think sons might define themselves against their fathers, but it's just less fraught. But since this is such a dramatic terrain with so many angles, I'm curious, what are some of your favorite mother-daughter memoirs, Brooke, or ones that you view as kind of the most significant in the genre?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Honestly, it was a little hard to think about when you first posed it, that I take a look at this for this question, because like I said, I think there are so many memoirs that touch upon these dynamics, even if they're not necessarily central to the story. But I had to come back to Vivian Gornick's Fierce Attachments. And it's such a classic. And I think it opened the door for a lot of people to think about their relationships with their mothers and to writing about their relationships with their mothers. In a more experimental vein, I thought about Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, because it's a graphic memoir. And so it's just a little bit different in terms of its presentation, but it's about the complex dynamics of her life with her mother. So many coming of age memoirs are about mothers. I just wanted to, put in a plug for two women I'm close to who have written beautiful mother-daughter memoirs, in both cases about abandonment. Linda Joy Myers, who I teach memoir with, her book is called Don't Call Me Mother, about her mother leaving her when she was a little girl and then later not publicly wanting to claim her as her daughter. And then Melissa Sestaro, who is a friend and for a long time worked at Book Passage here in the Bay Area and who teaches memoir. Her book is called Pieces of My Mother, also about how her mother left her family, herself and her siblings when she was a little girl. And so then her dad was left to raise them. And there are just countless of these kinds of stories. And She Writes Press has done many memoirs by daughters about their mothers, but also by mothers about their daughters. And some of the ones by the mothers have to do often, I would say, about having a child with disabilities or with addiction issues. So of course, sometimes those are daughters, sometimes those are sons. And so the impact goes both ways. And it's actually, it's just such a central relationship of our lives, like I was saying before. So how about you, Grant? What are a couple of your faves?
Yeah, I can't say that I'm super well versed in the genre, but Cheryl Strayed's Wild, of course, comes to mind, where her mom's death from cancer at a young age is the catalyst for Cheryl Strayed's, self-destructive behavior and then her eventual decision to hike the Pacific Coast Trail. And I think maybe most famously is probably the first mother-daughter memoir I was ever exposed to, which was Mommy Dearest by Christina Crawford. And it plays large in my mind because the movie came out when I was a teen. And there's the famous hanger scene, of course, where Joan Crawford finds wire hangers in Christina's closet and yells, "No wire hangers ever." I guess that was the first hugely dysfunctional relationship, and I just saw it on screen. But Mother, Daughter, Me by Katie Hafner is probably the closest memoir to the silent treatment, in that both memoirs chronicle the author's experience of living with or near their mother. And in Hafner's case, her mother, lives with her and her teenage daughter, which is also similar. I just found out about this yesterday, that Katie Royf just wrote in the Wall Street Journal an essay on the anxiety of having her aging mother move in with her. Her mother's 92 years old. So Rick, one of the interesting parts about this memoir, The Silent Treatment, is how Jeannie, she needs to feel permission to write this memoir. Her mother gives her permission over and over again and doesn't seem to be meddling at all. But there's still this fear of telling this story that haunts the actual writing of it. And I know this same concern or fear is really a part of any memoir. But since you just wrote this great Substack piece on the negative reception that Molly Jong Fast has received for her portrayal of her mother, Erica Jong, I was wondering if you could talk more about that, and especially because some of the critique of Molly revolved around the ethical implications of writing about someone who cannot defend herself. And Molly didn't need her mom's permission to write the memoir, but there were a lot of considerations in order to feel free to write it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there were a lot of considerations on Molly's part. Like maybe she did need to wait until she was sure her mom wouldn't be able to weigh in a meaningful way due to the severity of her dementia. I thought about that. I'm sure other people have. I don't know what fears Molly felt about the whole process. We tried to unpack that a little bit with her in our interview, but I think she kind of circled it a little bit, didn't really get to the heart of it. She is definitely feeling the backlash one way or another. Her book has just elicited a lot of feelings. I think this is about what we owe our mothers. And then unique to Erica Jong, there is a lot of hero worship going on, among a very particular subset of women who I think came of age when Fear of Flying came out, and just really think highly of Erica and think that what Molly is doing is not okay. I found the entire thing quite fascinating because I think it's a lesson in projection. We project onto people our own feelings, our own insecurities. We also can tend to idealize people. I think a lot of people are idealizing Erica, not knowing anything about her, of course. I wrote in my Substack post that you're likely going to relate to Molly's book, which is How to Lose Your Mother, based on the lens that you're reading through. Is it the lens of the mother, the lens of the daughter, the lens of being a fan of Erica Jong's work? But for sure, people in general are afraid to write their stories because of what their mothers will think. And to that end, I thought about Melissa Febos, because this is essentially the topic of Melissa's TED Talk. And she talks about sharing her memoir, one of her earlier memoirs, because now she's written several, but it was the one about her being a sex worker. And she shared the book with her therapist mother, and she was completely terrified about how her mother would react. And you have to watch the TED Talk because it's a really great, sweet talk about she and her mom. And I saw most recently that Melissa had dedicated her new memoir to her mother, which didn't surprise me at all. But I appreciate this a lot because we often hear about the terrible mothers, and we don't hear often enough about the mothers who are actually supportive and who are adoring and who want us to be able to write our stories, and sort of the more nuanced dynamics of those kinds of relationships, which I relate to because my mom reads everything I write. And so you put yourself out there in memoir and it's exposing, and then the layer of that is like, oh, okay, whatever I'm going to put down here, my mom is going to see. And in some cases, of course, there are things that she doesn't know about. And so it just adds to the fraught mix of exposure.
That's so funny, Brooke. I have a friend who says, I learn more about you on your podcast than I do in real life.
You're like, well, yeah, obviously.
So anyway, yeah. One thing I admired with Jeannie was how she used literary techniques to create empathy for, obviously a very challenging mother. Maybe all of mothers and fathers and sons and daughters are challenging. But, you experience those flaws as a reader, yet my feelings toward her mother wasn't necessarily full of frustration because Jeannie keeps a sort of running dialogue with her mother throughout the book. And it's not actual dialogue, but she uses a lot of like parenthetical phrases with her mother's thoughts or past statements. So it's like her mother is actually ever present and talking and even shaping the story. She's very much a human being in this, not a villain. I thought it was really interesting how Jeannie said she wrote this memoir for her mom and that she was very conscientious about writing it out of a place of love, which I thought was really interesting. And you always feel her need to understand, like that's very palpable in the memoir. And she's just searching, I think, for some sort of peace and doing it in a thoughtful way. So that really guides the story. And it's interesting because Molly Jong Fast wasn't necessarily looking for forgiveness or to forgive or really reconcile in any way with her mother. She was really just trying to tell the blunt truth of her experience with her mother.
Yeah, that was my take for sure, Grant. And I wanted to write about it in my Substack because I was hoping to give permission, and permission is another subject of today's conversation with Jeannie for sure, but to give permission to all the other people who are not Molly, who are writing stories about their mothers, to stand strong, just to say like, yes, you can do this. It's really hard to watch someone get publicly raked over the coals for telling their truth. This happens in memoir over and over and over again. And so I tend to be kind of vigilant about it. And I try to call it out when I see it. And on some level, you're going to confront judgments from others when you write your story and when you tell your truth. And so we're going to delve into a little bit of that with today's guest. But I think that Jeannie just has some super interesting perspectives. And this is always a evergreen and ever interesting topic about mothers and daughters. And so we'll be right back after this short interlude.
Well, Brooke, I'm always so pleased when we have a sponsor whose products and services I've actually used and enjoyed independently. And that's the case with Gotham Writers Workshop. I took my first class with them nearly 20 years ago, and it was an online class, my first online class ever. And I had my MFA at the time, and I have to say that my Gotham class was as good as any of my MFA classes. And in fact, the great writer Manuel Gonzalez taught it. But it wasn't just about Manuel. All of the students in the course were super smart and really good writers. And amazingly enough, I'm still in touch with some of them. So I wholeheartedly recommend taking any of Gotham's courses.
I love that so much. And Gotham definitely has a high pedigree, and it's been around for a long time. They offer creative writing classes in New York City, but also over Zoom, and also asynchronous classes that you can take online. And so you can be anywhere in the world. And they have an amazing breadth of offerings, Grant. They offer memoir classes, woohoo, but also other nonfiction, as well as fiction, poetry, songwriting, and many others, and with super qualified instructors and for an affordable price.
Yeah. And as I mentioned, they are very much about community, so you can stay involved with Gotham in a number of ways, and they even put on conferences. And writers often ask me how to find a writing group or a beta reader, and I think taking a class is a great way to find good writing partner matches. So develop your craft and join a vibrant community of writers at Gotham Writers Workshop.
Yes, you can find them at gothamwriters.com to see what classes are starting. Use our code, please, Memoir Nation at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply there, but definitely go check it out. And so endorse them, Grant.
Yeah. So one more time, visit gothamwriters.com to see what classes are starting soon, and use the code Memoir Nation, all one word, Memoir and Nation with no space between them, at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply. And tell them that Grant sent you, and Brooke too. Welcome back, everybody. I am super happy to introduce Jeannie Vanasco, who is the author of the Memoirs, Memoirs, plural, Things We Didn't Talk About When I Was a Girl, which was named a New York Times Editor's Choice and a Best Book of 2019 by Time, Esquire, Kirkus, among others, and The Glass Eye, which poets and writers called one of the 5 best literary nonfiction debuts of 2017. Her third book, A Silent Treatment, is being published by Tin House and is on the shelves in bookstores in September. And Jeannie was born and raised in Sandusky, Ohio. She lives in Baltimore and is an associate professor of English at Towson University. Welcome, Jeannie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I was initially attracted to your book by its title. and because I've experienced the silent treatment from various people, including my mother. And I have to confess that I've used the silent treatment myself. And I think it's perhaps one of the most ineffective communication styles, in that I don't think anyone wins. I think it causes pain for everyone, and perhaps especially pain for the one practicing the silence. And I don't think I've ever seen it, lead anywhere constructive either. So this is all to say that I'm curious how this was your window into your relationship with your mom, and the way that you chose to tell this story of your relationship with her.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So for the longest time, I had wanted to write a book for my mom. I just didn't know what the conflict would be. I felt really insecure about portraying her negatively, even though years ago when I had mentioned to her that I wanted to write a book for her, and she said, "You can't just write about me, you need something else." She also thought she wasn't interesting enough. And so I think for a long time, I just didn't know how I was going to portray our relationship and what the framing device would be. And it wasn't until after she moved in with me and started using the silent treatment that I began to reevaluate our relationship and what it had been, but also to feel a great deal of empathy for her, because even though the silent treatment is this extraordinarily painful experience, I recognized that it was coming from a place of pain for her. And so as soon as I started thinking about her use of the silent treatment and how angry it made me and how uncomfortable I felt accessing anger at my mom, as soon as I started thinking through all of this, something clicked. I think because because it involved a lot of shame. I find shame very generative. And just because it caused me to look at my mom in a more complicated way. I think in my first book, I was moving away from this process of idealizing a parent, which it focused on my dad. So we're sort of this delayed adolescence. Like usually when you're a teenager, you're supposed to see your parents as these, you start to look at them and think, wait, like what? Like you're the adult? You see that immature behavior. And it took me a very long time to see that in my parents. And I don't know if it was a result of being an only child, being raised an only child, and not having a sibling to be like, hey, like mom's using the silent treatment again. That's really wrong, right? And I just took it as like this behavior is normal. So experiencing it from her when I was an adult, it just got me reflecting on my childhood, how she'd used it with my dad. And then just also like, oh my God, I'm mad at my mom. I feel like I'm doing something wrong. Like I'm not supposed to be mad at her. She's perfect. And it really is this delayed adolescence of seeing my mom as a complicated person who's allowed to make mistakes. I mean, I know it intellectually, but experiencing it was altogether a different thing.
I'm curious about that framing, writing a book for your mom. And I'd love to have you say a little bit more, because what's one of the more interesting things about your book is that you write about needing, you're talking about needing permission. And yet you write, I need to remember she knows about this project, its title, its premise, has known its title and premise for almost 2 years now. And in that time, how many times have I asked for her permission? And then you write mom, and it's her saying, you don't need to keep asking. You're the writer. You write what you need to write. So it's so curious to me. Like it sounds on the one hand amazingly supportive, and that you want to write this book for her, but you had to find an angle in. And I'd just love to know a little bit more about this dynamic between the two of you, of her supporting your writing, even as you're writing something challenging about her.
My mom should be the patron saint of memoirs someday. Like just how open she is about all of this. And she hasn't read the book yet. So she still hasn't, she's waiting. And hopefully there won't be a sequel, Silent Treatment. I've told her, I had asked her to read it. And she said, well, then what am I going to do? Like what? I'm going to tell you what you can't include. Why would I do that? Then it's no longer your book. And I really appreciate it. I don't think many memoirs necessarily have that experience. Some people lose relationships as a result of publishing a memoir. I'm not saying that happens frequently, but obviously it can happen. And so my relationship with my mom, she's always been very supportive of my writing. And I don't know. The question was just more about my relationship with my mom.
Well, I just found it really different. I mean, a lot of people write memoirs and either they're worried that their parents are going to be upset. In this case, it seems like you knew she wasn't going to be. And I'm curious if that, did that deepen your relationship with her? I mean, she sounds like an unusual parent, I guess, on the one hand, which you said, which is totally wonderful, but it's something we just haven't heard before. That's all.
I appreciate her openness to it. And I'm still not quite fully sure why. Like, something I thought through a lot was, okay, ethically, just because she gave me permission, does that still mean it's okay? I think about that sometimes, like, asking for permission is one thing. And if somebody gives it, like, okay, well, under what circumstances? And I think, so this it's a really good question. It gets at that question of like, my relationship with my mom, because I do think of her as this parent who put so much of her own life on the side. Like, everything felt like it was for me, which could be kind of overwhelming, that, where I got the sense she's sacrificing so much. And I was concerned that when she said I could do it, I'm like, is this another instance of her doing what she thinks a good mother should do? Like, is she actually okay with it? And so it was interesting experiencing the silent treatment, because it felt so generative, because it reminded me of all of these other aspects of our relationship, both the good and the bad.
Jeannie, as I mentioned earlier, I'm just very personally intrigued by the silent treatment as this kind of flawed approach to communications. And as you said, it's immature, and yet very mature people practice it. And I thought your own exploration and your own searches to understand it were really interesting in the book. And at one point you watched YouTube videos about the silent treatment, and you gave perspective from a licensed psychologist about how to deal with it. And he or she said, when you highlight how their actions impact you, they'll keep doing it to remain in control. The more out of control you appear to be, the more in control they feel. And so I'm really interested in this idea of control as a motive, because as I thought about that, I was thinking how when we use language, when we use our words, we're creating a space, because language is some sort of invitation, no matter what. It's an opening by definition. Whereas silence, nullifies possibilities, especially if it's a tense silence. And so silence becomes this barrier that inherently makes the other person, the receiver of it, vulnerable, I think. And so I was wondering if you could tell us more about the silent treatment and issues of control.
When I was working on the book, I initially thought that a silent treatment was going to be more of a hybrid, where it would involve a lot of research. I did a ton of research into the history of punitive silence. The book was sold under that kind of summary, that I was going to look at all the different iterations of punitive silence and look at the gendered aspects and so on. It made me sound so much smarter than I am. And I think like the research was a means of control. And I held on to this idea that I had to do that or had to be an expert, even though that's not the type of writing I've ever done. And really the research that was most helpful to me wasn't necessarily the academic stuff about dyadic ostracism, but these YouTube videos of like people sharing their experiences with it, or licensed psychologists. So people who weren't professionals or experts. And in my effort to have control over the experience, thinking if I learn as much as I possibly can, I can end it or I can figure things out. I realized, though, that, like my experience of trying to get control is part of the story. And that's part of so that meta element of me trying to figure it out. Something clicked for me where I realized, I can't find any case studies within psychology about anyone who's experienced an extended period of silence. I thought, what if my book in some ways is that? Like, here is one person's experience with a particular silence, rather than me trying to be very authoritative, which is how I end up including the YouTube videos or talking to the Google Home Mini and getting stupid answers that, quotes Quora. And so then I also, though, was thinking about how to metabolize some of this research. So all while the silent treatment's going on and I'm like crying every day, I'm in a ton of pain because I'm like, oh my God, I'm a horrible daughter. And so this research helped me feel a sense of control. I think the writing helped me feel a sense of control. But it also led to me making some excuses. So early in the book, when Chris is kind of a device. He's getting really great reviews from people early on. Somebody just called him an oasis of calm and reason amid two women who seem to be having nervous breakdowns.
He seems like a very nice guy. Yeah.
He is very nice. So I was like, okay, you get another great review. But he thought I should just try to end it. And I had found this research that said, don't do that. So there was a way in which all of this information I was taking in, I wasn't always considering how it applied to my unique situation. I was making excuses too, because I was afraid of my mom. And so when Chris comes in, I was like, why don't you just go down there? I end up using him kind of as a means of emphasizing my character. If we think about it in terms of craft, like my character's tragic flaw, I'm always interested in that in writing. Like if the character would just do or say this one thing, the book would be over. Like done, like everything's resolved. And so at the beginning, when Chris is like, why don't you just go down there? And I cite these reasons and I think about those YouTube videos. It's like, there's if I could just also talk, like if I could just break it, then maybe the book would be over. What would have happened? Like it would be a very different book. So I think doing all of that kind of research and then trying to shape what felt like a very shapeless experience. I mean, that I hesitate to say it was like therapeutic, or that's not why I did it. But I think being able to see myself as a character and being able to distance myself a little bit certainly helped me navigate the situation. So I do like writing from within an experience for that reason.
Well, I was very interested in a passage you wrote about perspective, because in writing about complicated situations, we hope that we gain clarity in our writing, but then that's not always the case. And you write, perspective isn't true because we never have perspective. And the moment that we're experiencing is the truest thing. And you're telling this to Chris, and he says you should write that down. And then you say, that's why I get so frustrated, I continue, when people think memoir is strictly about the past. We tell stories about the past to make sense of why we feel or think the way we do, but we don't really know anything. So I was curious about if you can unpack that and tell us more about how perspective isn't necessarily true.
I think this is why you can get people who are career memoirists, right? Or who even write about the same experience years later, and it's a different book because time has passed. You've changed to some degree. We just look at things differently because we've had so much happen in the time between. And I'm so fascinated about writing from within an experience, because I think when I was working on this and I was on the book and I was thinking back to previous silent treatments, I couldn't reconstruct them. And I couldn't honestly reconstruct how I felt. Like I could say yes, I could make a list of adjectives of how I felt. But once the silent treatment was over, I was just so glad it was over that I was eager to forget a lot of how I had felt during it. Like I just wanted to move on. And so I just in regards specifically to my experience with my mom's silent treatment, I don't think I could have written a memoir about her and about the silent treatment without having written from that idea of writing from within an experience.
I'm interested in this idea of writing from within an experience, because I think what you're saying is that you're in the midst of experiencing this thing, right? And you're writing about it in real time, as opposed to people who are writing about things that happened 5-20 years ago. Am I right in understanding that?
Right.
Yeah, I would love, we're winding down the interview, and I'd love for you to say more about that, because I think a lot of people are told, it's important to have distance. And yet we see books, I was thinking about like Danny Shapiro's Inheritance, for instance, where it's like in real time, kind of, it's something that just happened. And so, and given that you've written a couple different memoirs, what advice would you have for people who are really wanting to unpack that thing that they're going through in the moment? And is there anything, uniquely difficult or compromising about that?
I like writing from within the moment while also just like I still reflecting on the past. I'm very much a writer who I write in many ways by collage, because I'm not quite sure what the narrative frame is going to be, because I think the longer you work on a memoir, the more difficult it can be to like manage the reflection, to manage the tone. I mean, things are going to shift, of course, but my advice is to just write from within whatever moment you're in. Let it be a mess. And like wait until you've gotten a significant amount down, until you figure out what the time frame is for like where you're beginning in the reflection and where you're ending in the period of time. I think of that as the container of like the reflection being the plot, and the reflection is going to change the longer you work on something. And so I think you can end up getting in a rut if you think like, okay, I need to figure out what the narrative present is, or like where it begins and ends. And pretty soon, as more time goes on, you're going to find, or at least I found myself trying to write from within an experience that had happened like a year ago, 2 years ago. And that feels a little inauthentic. So I am a big fan of like trying not to be precious about it. Writing, I use my voice memo app a lot. I just talked to my phone and recorded some things, wrote on napkins. I just like my advice is to write out of order. And I believe it eventually comes. You start to see, if you write enough down, you start to see the patterns. And once you see the patterns, I think a shape usually reveals itself.
I agree. I write very similarly in a spirit of collage. So I totally understand where you're coming from. So thank you so much, Jeannie, for joining us.
Thank you, Jeannie.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll be right back with today's book trend.
Well, Brooke, I think we might need to categorize this week's book trend as Grant's cranky book trend. I'm a little bit cranky with this one, and I just have to say that up front to frame this. But I just became aware of a trend that it just caught me off guard, and one that I think is horribly unfair to writers. I contacted Book Passage, which is one of my favorite bookstores in the Bay Area, because I wanted to see if they'd host a reading for my new book when it comes out in January. And they said yes, they'd love to host a reading. I was feeling really good. And they said that I had the standing as an author for them to do so. And that was really good. But then they said they had a new policy of charging authors for advertising, I guess, as they put it, and that I'd have to pay $150 to have my reading there. And I'd actually never heard of bookstores charging authors to host readings for a new book. So I was curious, have you heard of such a policy?
So yes, I actually have. And I think the deal is here that publishers have largely been covering these costs maybe forever. And that what the trend might be is that they're really putting this on authors more so than going back to the publishers and asking for it. But it is called a co-op fee. So it actually has a formal name. And bookstores have historically charged this back to publishers for as long as I've been in the industry, so certainly 20 years. Obviously, this thing about asking authors for it directly is probably the result of just how many different kinds of authors, from self-published to hybrid published to indie published to traditional published, that bookstores are interfacing with. But, I do empathize, because bookstores do and certainly can lose money on hosting events. I also understand that it's a hard fee for authors to swallow, because I hear about it a lot from my own authors. And even if an event does do well and the bookstore sells a lot of books, which makes it worth it for them, it's still a lot of work. And I think that there's a little bit, I hear this from my own authors, and I'm not suggesting you're saying this, Grant, but there's a little bit of like, what are you going to do for me attitude that authors sometimes bring to bookstores. And I try to encourage my authors to think about, what can I do for you? Because you may or may not bring out crowds, and then the bookstore honestly doesn't know whether or not it's going to be worth it to them. And that's why every time I do a bookstore event, which is usually in the capacity of interviewing authors or introducing authors, I always bake into the conversation to the audience that they should buy something, anything, before they leave to support the bookstore that's putting on the event.
Yeah, I do that as well. Definitely always make a big case for it. And, you know, you're making me more sympathetic to the bookstores here, but I'm gonna go back to my cranky side.
Fair.
Just because, you know.
Yep, totally fair.
But yeah, so I do know that bookstores have slim margins, and it's just super tough for bookstores to make a go of it, obviously, because so many independent bookstores are going under. But like something needs to be changed here, and I'm not sure who needs to change it, because authors, you know, we get paid absolutely nothing for a bookstore event. You know, we get paid in like bookstore sales if we ever earn out our advance, assuming we got an advance. But and usually it goes beyond that. Like I think I probably incur expenses, you know, for events because I'm traveling and the time I spend, and not just at the reading, but in promoting the reading on social media and sending emails to friends. So I always work very hard for my events, and I generally fill the room. And I always feel like bringing 25 or 30 people into a store just seems like a pretty good thing for the bookstore, you know, because those people might return to the bookstore and return for other events. And I think that's what hurt me about the book passage charge, was that the last time I did a reading with them, I brought in a lot of people who I know bought books. And I guess the way I look at it also is that we're in an ecosystem together, you know, authors and bookstores. And so I feel like we need to be symbiotically generous to each other. And I also think that a bookstore shouldn't view an author as a source of revenue, you know, someone to make more money off of, when we're the ones providing the cheap, later produced the product they make money from. So I think they have an obligation to support authors just as we support them.
Yeah, and I understand that vantage point 100%, Grant. You're coming at it from an author's point of view, of course, and I've heard my authors say similar things over the years. And it is interesting to me because I think this was a cost that authors historically just haven't seen, and that publishers have always paid it. And from the vantage point of the bookstore, you know, I see that they're taking a risk to have the event in the first place, you know, which they have to host, they promote. Book Passage puts the event up on their site. They have a dedicated employee to introduce the author. And then, of course, they sell the books. And so, you know, yeah, if you could draw 30, 40 people, it's an interesting question as to whether that co-op fee is negotiable, because I think it is. I think there's, you know, you could negotiate it down, or you can say, I know I'm going to bring 40 people, and so would you please waive it? And I think it's important for authors to understand that, but I wouldn't say that every author should do that, because not every author brings 40 people. You know, a lot of authors hope, you know, they sort of send out a hope and a prayer, and then 5 people might show up. And in that case, I think it's quite fair that a bookstore is saying, look, we're taking a chance on you, and this is a payment for you to use this space, because if you wanted to host an event somewhere else, you'd have to pay more than $150 in my general experience. So I think it's just a good mindset shift for authors to think about how bookstores are making it, you know, that their margins are thin, like we're talking about how they see co-op fees, which is essentially covering their costs and maybe not even. And I think Book Passage is especially awesome about this, just in the sense that they host so many events and they don't say no to self-published authors. They've been such a friend to us and really will host almost any event that we ask them to. And the hope, of course, is that we continue to come and to buy, but it's more than that, just because there are a lot of additional fees. And I think the co-op just makes them feel like they have the ability to say yes, when the alternative might just be that it's not worth doing.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one key advantage of this type of policy. You know, it does allow more diverse and indie authors, you know, to get a chance to get bookstore events, especially at a prestigious place like Book Passage. I worry a little bit about it. It's only allowing those who can afford to pay for the exposure, you know, so there's a certain amount of privilege baked into the process. So yeah, I'm in the end, I'm very supportive of this sort of delicate ecosystem that we inhabit together, and a big fan of independent bookstores and want to support them as much as I can. And I guess just somehow I feel like I don't know what the answer is, because throughout the book industry, it's tough to make a living all the way through it, really.
Isn't that the truth? And I think that that's the real trend.
Yeah.
That being an author is more expensive than ever. And that is a tough one, but true. And, I think, we're coming at it in an interesting place because I'm often in this position of having to talk through with my authors, just how hard the industry part is. And authors are like, well, the author part is hard too. And it just is, so think about all of this as you're plodding along, with all of your authorly ambitions, that there are just things that are hard along the way, and we can commiserate, and we can also be out there doing events. And, if we need to negotiate with bookstores around what we can and can't pay for, we can do that too. Anyway, food for thought. And certainly always, dear listeners, we hope that we give you good food for thought week in and week out. And we're happy to be back with you in our new round of shows and our new season. And we're trying really hard, as always, to gain visibility and new listeners, partly so that we can find sponsors and always keep this show free to our listeners. And so one thing that we would ask is that you rate us. I think it's been a long time since we've asked, but giving us some stars, or better yet, a review, that takes about 90 seconds to 3 minutes of your time, which is about a 12th of the time I calculated that it takes to listen to this show. So please take this action if you will, and thank you. It means a lot to both of us, and we will be back in your feed next week.